Okay, so survival of the fattest is the title of my talk. The talk is going to cover quite a number of things, and for those of you, I think all of you that entered the room pretty much know me, but just on the assumption that somebody might watch the recorded video that doesn't know me, just a little bit of an introduction to myself. My background, although now I focus on doing hands-on work and teaching Pilates, my background is, in the generic sense, I'm an ologist. I did my degree in biophysics, and I've also got a further qualification in statistics, as one of my friends describes it, a qualification in big sums. I have since become a qualified nutritionist. My nutritionist journey has been an interesting one because for many years I self-researched, but then last year I did a qualification through the University of Cape Town to give something a little bit more formal in my nutritional training. And as many of you know, get me talking and I might not know quite when to stop. So we'll just see how this, hopefully it's interesting and hopefully it keeps your interest, and let's see how the journey goes. Well, today the talk will end up being able to throw some light onto four very different things. I will hopefully by the end of this session be able to explain to you why humans have fat babies. We're the only mammal that has fat babies. I'll also be able to explain to you why some of the fattest nations on the planet live in the Pacific Islands. I'll also be able to explain to you why autumn is very important in our obesity epidemic, and also make a link to Alzheimer's and dementia. So you can see there's going to be some varied outcomes of the talk, and of course I've now done an update as well in the light of the current situation. So let me give you some structure. The talk's going to be in 6 parts. I always like doing that so you get a sense of progress as we work through each of the parts of the talk. So there's my 6 parts. We're going to talk about the original pandemic, the pandemic of obesity, what made us ill, what gave us that pandemic, what's the evidence, what's the mechanisms. Let's have a little example of counting carbohydrates. You'll see carbohydrates become quite a big theme of my talk, and I'll give you an example of counting carbohydrates. And then I'm going to add that 6th part, which is the COVID update. Okay, so let's take the first part of the talk, the original pandemic. Well, here's a newspaper headline from actually nearly 3 years ago. Britain is the fat man of Europe. 63% of UK adults are overweight, and indeed overweight or obese. And we are significantly more fat, more obese than most other European countries. It's very relevant with the COVID epidemic because we know that obesity seems to be correlated with COVID-19 outcomes. And in 2004, the World Health Organization declared its first pandemic, and that was the pandemic of obesity. So in 2004, it was a world pandemic, and say the figure 3 years ago is that we were 63% already 63% overweight and obese. And when I first started giving talks about diet and nutrition, I can't remember exactly when that was. It's probably a couple of years ago. There was something that was very striking, and it was in the newspapers. A story unrelated to diet and nutrition posted a photograph of Brighton Beach in the early 1970s. And an observation was made in response to that article that doesn't everybody look slim compared to nowadays? So there was a picture of the beach in the 1970s. I couldn't find the corresponding picture from the beach in the 2018, I assume the year, but that's the picture that we're comparing it with essentially. So it was an observation that was made from this story that way back in the 70s, we had an average profile of what you'd expect with body shape, and that now seems to have changed in pretty much the 50 years since then. And that, as I say, is our first pandemic, the first pandemic that was declared by the World Health Organization. Now, in our evolution as an organism, we probably started diverging as primates from the same line that eventually has led to chimpanzees and gorillas. We probably diverged about 6 million years ago and moved from being quadrupeds to upright bipeds, hunter-gatherers. And over that 6 million years, we've developed our physique, we developed our body structure to make us better efficient at being bipeds. In the last 50 years, we've significantly changed that profile, and I'm just very figuratively describing that there. So what I'm going to examine in the first part of the talk is what has gone wrong. We had this nice progression as a hunter-gatherer. Why in the last 50 years has the profile of the human form changed so radically? And if we look at percentage of obesity in the population since 1800, the curve looks something like this. So that's the profile of obesity in our population, in the UK population, in the last 200 years or so. And there's some interesting points on that curve. But before I explore those points, everybody has a theory as to why we're putting on weight, why obesity has become a problem in the population. And there are many different elements to this theory. And they are things like we don't exercise enough, we eat too much fat, we don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, we eat too much salt, we drink too much alcohol, too much meat, eat too much sugar, eat too many processed foods. There's all sorts of theories as to why we have become A, a fat nation, and B, the fat nation of Europe. And there are merits and strengths to some of those. There are reasons why some of these things aren't particularly true. And I'm going to explore some of those in the talk. And in amongst all of those, there are many myths about diet and nutrition, and what I might use as the term, or what to describe using the term as fake news. And there are a number of those which I will partly be addressing in this talk. They're quite key to some of the outcomes of the talk, and I've listed them here. Cholesterol and saturated fat clogs your arteries. I want to look a little bit at that. Dieting is just about eating less and moving more. Unfortunately, that is a little bit of a myth. Eating fat makes you fat. That's one of the big myths. Whole grains are healthy. That's a very dubious statement. Eating red meat is bad for you, and being vegan is good for you. They're all things where there is now a lot of evidence, a lot of very good, robust scientific evidence that although these are the ideas we've had for the last 50 years, actually they're probably not true. And actually it's the pursuance of many of those myths that's probably been contributory, or one of the contributory factors, to our obesity epidemic. And I say some of these I will be exploring today, but not quite all of them. If we go back to our curve of obesity in the last 200 years, there are two very interesting points. I think my cursor should show. We've got a little bit what we call an inflection point mid to later 19th century. We've got a significant inflection point towards the end of the 1900s. Now, the first one of those, oh, actually, before I move on to that, I've got obesity as my vertical axis on the graph here, but I could have chosen any number of things: hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, dementia. These are all, and I will show you the link with these conditions later on in the talk, they're all aspects of the same underlying biochemical faults in our body. So although I'm going to use obesity as my marker in graphs and discussion, it could equally have been any of those other markers as well. So that's just putting that in context. Let me put obesity back onto the curve there. And let's look at the two inflection points. Well, the first one, which is only mildly inflected, but you can see as far as we can go from historical data, levels of obesity were fairly constant during many centuries of the last millennium. But when industrialized grain processing became accessible, or the results of industrialized grain processing became very accessible, that did change the dietary profile of the population. We started eating a lot more refined grain because it could be processed on a much bigger scale. So you see that started an upward trend that took us through both war periods. But we've got a much more significant inflection point coming in at about the 1980s. And I'm going to now explore, well, what happened? What's the likely cause for that inflection point there? And I'm going to start with the timeline. And I'm going to start my timeline in 1955. There's a very good book called The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teinholtz. And she goes through this history of, as you'll see, this history of diet and fat. And it starts really with Eisenhower in 1955. On the 23rd of September, to be precise, in 1955, he had his first heart attack. It was the first of quite a few heart attacks, and in the end it was a heart attack that finished him off. I think that was his 6th or his 7th, but he did die of heart disease. But in 1955 he had his first heart attack, and for the first time ever, a president of the United States was out of office for about 10 days. And that really made it high profile that heart disease was becoming a big problem, particularly in America, but not just in America. Heart disease was on the increase, and it was embodied in the fact that Eisenhower had his first heart attack. And as a result of the awareness, there was then a lot of activity in the intervening years up till the 1970s to try and identify what were the causes of this heart disease epidemic and what therefore were the solutions. And it culminated with Senator George Mcgovern, the guy pictured here, chairing a number of Senate committees in the mid to late 70s, looking at factors in heart disease. And one of the big outcomes of those Senate hearings, the Mcgovern hearings, was in 1980, the introduction of something called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. That's a picture of the latest copy. You'll notice there shall be a new version coming out this year, the 9th edition. But in 1980, you had the first delivery of something called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And essentially, that was the first time a government anywhere told its people what to eat. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 1980 was the first time we were told what to eat. Well, let's have a look what indeed we were told to eat way back in the 1980s. And what the Dietary Guidelines essentially did was subdivide components of food or types of food into 4 categories. Dietary saturated fat, typically the fat you get from meat. Dietary cholesterol, again, typically the fat you get from meat and animal products. Grains and cereals, and vegetable oils and margarines. Now, I'm going to just have a little aside here. I do sometimes change this term, but what we actually mean here are the synthetic mass-produced oils. I don't mean olive oil. I don't mean coconut oil. Oils that can naturally be squeezed out of something aren't in that category. What it is in that category are things like vegetable oil, which is chemically retrieved and has to be chemically modified to be without smell, without color, and to have a shelf life. Things like margarines, synthetically made fats and oils. And in the dietary guidelines, because of the 2 categories on our left, dietary saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, we were told to eat more vegetable oil. And in fact, that is the spirit of what the guidelines said. They told us to eat less dietary fat, eat less dietary cholesterol, increase our consumption of grains and cereals, and increase our consumption of the synthetic vegetable oils and margarines. So there was some mention of sugar, but it wasn't a big deal in 1980. There was some talk of salt, but that wasn't a big deal in 1980. So essentially the big elements of the dietary change in these guidelines was cut your fat, sourced pretty much from animal fats, and increase your consumptions of grains and cereals. Now, one thing I've just realized I didn't do, and I need to do for a little bit later in this talk, is that I need to make sure I'm sharing the sound because I'm going to play a video. So what I'm just going to do, I've put the display on pause for the moment. And what I'm going to do now is just when I'm going to reshare, I'm going to make sure the sound is turned on. So that was, despite my little post-it note telling me to do that, I forgot to do that. So let's get there, share the computer sound. I think that seems to be all happening very nicely now. So there we are. Let me go back to that slide where we've got the components. It's probably just going to make me go through the stages again. So we've got the 4 pillars of the dietary guidelines, and we reduce the 2 forms of natural fat, and we increase the consumption of the grain, cereals, and the synthetic oils. Now, since then, since 1980, the evidence is we've pretty much done what we were told. If we look at dietary profiles, declarations of what people eat, since that time, we have indeed cut our consumption of saturated fat and cholesterol, and we have significantly increased the consumption of grains, cereals, and the synthetic oils and margarines. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a slight clawing back of this last one. People have been moving away from margarines and are once more eating butter again. But for much of the 50 years since these, or the 40 years since these guidelines came in, we did indeed eat more margarines and less of butter. So we're pretty good. And notice the dietary guidelines of 1980 correspond very nicely to where our inflection point is in the scale of obesity. Now, that's not enough to prove causation, but it immediately starts, oh, there was a big change in our diets. In 1980, something big changed in our diets, and something big, quite literally, pun intended, something big happened to us as a nation. So are the 2 things correlated and linked? Well, let's move on and let's have a look at the next stage. That was the original pandemic, the pandemic of obesity, declared by the World Health Organization in 2004. Now, this is the bit that I wanted to share with you. It's a little video clip. It's from a documentary, and this section from the documentary starts with some live footage of the Mcgovern hearings. This is quite an interesting little bit of footage. There's some discussion from a few clinicians about the context of the results of the hearings, as well as some footage from the hearing itself. You'll hear George Mcgovern speak. You'll hear one of the scientists around the table openly question where the committee's conclusions were going, and you'll hear George Mcgovern say, well, he doesn't have the luxury of time of waiting for all the evidence. So hopefully you'll hear the sound with this.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day.
You know, there were eminent scientists of the time saying this is nonsense. There is no good scientific evidence that either fat or cholesterol, you know, is at the root of heart disease.
I said to the professor that I was working with, you know, this is not right. Animal fat's not causing this, and this is not what the data says.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
The Mcgovern Committee's report was written by a young staff member who happened to be a vegetarian and had no background in medicine or health research. The committee recommended a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet for everyone and offered some ideas that could only spring from the mind of a politician.
But Senator Schweiker of Pennsylvania suggested that instead of discrediting the committee's report, the eggmen should be out developing hens that would lay low-cholesterol eggs.
Soon after the Mcgovern report was issued, the USDA got into the act. Carol Tucker Foreman, the assistant secretary at the time, believed in the low-fat diet theory and wanted to issue official government guidelines to tell everybody how to eat. To make sure she was on solid scientific ground, she consulted with Philip Handler, the head of the National Academy of Sciences. Just one little problem. Handler told her the Mcgovern Committee's report was nonsense. So she did what any dedicated government official would do. She ignored him, shopped around for a scientist who agreed with her, then issued the guidelines. Thanks to a handful of politicians with no background in science, the heart-healthy benefits of a low-fat diet became official government policy. And real scientists got the message loud and clear. Tell us what we already believe, or you can say goodbye to your lucrative government funding.
So as you can see, that documentary is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it does convey some of the key elements that in the 1977 Mcgovern hearings, dietary fat and dietary cholesterol were very much seen as the villains that have been leading to and causing the cardiovascular disease, the heart disease epidemic that was not just there in America, but in most of the industrialized countries of the world. But looking back at the evidence, there was indeed very little evidence to prove that that was in fact the case. But the dietary guidelines through the USDA are the Dietetics Association of America. Through the USDA, they issued these dietary guidelines in 1980. And we've got the two sides of the story here. So we've got the villains on the left, we've got the heroes on the right. So just as I conveyed to you before. And what this led to is what I call the era of fat phobia. So from the 1980s, and it's an era I've grown up in all the time I was growing up, and as an adult, young adult, very much it was frowned upon to use lard to cook with. You shouldn't eat too many eggs. You should trim the fat off the meat. We were well and truly in a fat phobic era. And because of that fat phobic era, there are a number of issues which will be impacting our health. And what I'd like to do is try and use a common sense argument rather than just purely resorting to detailed science to say, can that be a valid argument? Can we say that eating those things, the lard, the eggs, the meat, the fat on the meat, have been contributory to, okay, we've been talking about heart disease there, but remember there's this whole suite of conditions. Obesity and heart disease were two of them, but amongst them there was hypertension, there was dementia, and there were other conditions as well. So let me stack up the two components of the diet. On the left-hand side, we've got the things we were told to eat less of in the dietary guidelines. And on the right-hand side, effectively, I've got the things we were told to eat more of. So we've got some synthetic oils, margarine, we've got some refined carbohydrates, and we've got all those things embodied in a processed meal. The guidelines didn't say you should eat processed meals, but by virtue of what the guidelines were saying, processed meals seemed to be part of the package. Well, let's look pre the dietary guidelines. We did eat quite a lot of natural fats, saturated fats, cholesterol foods, or foods that contain cholesterol. And then following the dietary guidelines, we do continue to eat fewer of those things. Similarly, or conversely, prior to the dietary guidelines, we ate some grains and cereals. Remember in the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, there was the significant step changes in industrial grain processing that allowed more of us to have access to processed grains, wheats and cereals. So we did eat some, but following the dietary guidelines, introduction of the dietary guidelines, the consumption of grains, processed grains, cereals, and the synthetic oils. Synthetic oils only probably became something in the very beginning of the 20th century. The first solid synthetic fats were at the turn of the 20th century, trying to find alternative uses actually for cottonseed oil. Cottonseed oil up to that point had been used as a fuel for lighting and heating, and then with gas and petrochemicals, it was no longer needed. So chemists worked with it and tried play with it, and they produced this solid substance which you could pretend, if you colored it and flavored it, you could pretend was butter. So that was the first time we had these synthetic fats. But since the dietary guidelines, we've been eating a lot more of those things. But here's the hypothesis. In the era where we've been eating fewer of the foods which are supposedly causing our heart disease and our obesity and all these other conditions, we're eating fewer of those, and yet we have more of these conditions. And I'll contrast that. The foods that we're eating more of are meant to be the ones that are heart healthy. By sticking to a low-fat diet, they're meant to be targeting being overweight and obesity. We're eating more of those foods, and yet we have more of those conditions that they're meant to be helpful to prevent. So there's a logical disconnect straight away here. We're eating less of the foods that are supposedly the villains, more of the foods that are supposedly the heroes of the piece, and yet we've got worse outcomes, and outcomes that are getting worse. The obesity curve is not leveling. It's certainly not going downwards, but it's not leveling. So although that's not robust scientific evidence, it's almost at the point of there's no point trying to delve into evidence if you can't overcome this first stumbling block. Why is it, if we're eating less of the foods that are meant to be good for us, and less of the foods that are meant to be bad for us and more of the foods that are good for us, why is our health not improving? And so what I want to propose is that actually we've got this the wrong way round. That actually, rather than these things that we think are the hero foods, they're actually the villain foods. And the things that have been stacked up as the villains of the piece, actually, maybe it's been to our detriment not to be including so much in our diets. So that's the supposition of what made us ill. It's sort of a real sort of shifting of over the last 40 years of dietary change. Actually, maybe the change was in the wrong direction. So let's now pose that question. Let me look at what's the evidence for that. So I've given you a logical argument which is suggesting that doesn't quite stack up, does it? Because if we're eating less of the foods that are bad for us, why is our health getting worse? Now, one of the big problems we have, and I'm sure you've all seen this, is that you open up any media channel, any newspaper, any magazine, go online to any page, you can guarantee, not necessarily once a day, but several times a week, there will be a headline where there is that immortal two-word phrase, study shows. Study shows food is good for you. Study shows food is bad for you. Study shows eating something is going to be harmful. Eating something is going to be really good for you. So we have this two-word phrase, study shows. And because these studies, what these studies show, seems so contradictory so often, we as a consumer are just left in more confusion than ever before. So we've got a problem. There is no clear guidance on what we should or shouldn't be eating, because all the time through media channels, we're getting mixed information and mixed evidence. And what I would like to talk to you about is what is the basis for most of these studies? Those things that say study shows, where do these studies come from? Well, they're actually what we call epidemiological studies. And essentially what an epidemiological study is, somebody comes along, they stratify, they randomly select a group of people, part of the population, and they ask them a question like, what did you eat last week or last month? And they rely on that person faithfully recording exactly what they ate last week or last month. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was asked that point blank right now, even if it was only last week, my recollection would have probably a little bit of latitude, shall we say. I might be prone to over-report the foods I feel that are good foods, maybe under-report in my diary the foods that are my bad foods. But essentially, that is the spirit of what we call an epidemiological study. And what epidemiological studies do, we collect all the data from questionnaires like that, and statisticians try and look for patterns. Look at those people who say they eat bacon or they eat avocados or whatever. You look at patterns. Are those people more or less likely to show certain health outcomes, certain traits? And so really it's all about asking people what they ate and then looking for patterns. And the reason we have to do that is because of the ethics of essentially locking people away in complete isolation, although that's a very poignant point we're making at the moment, but locking people away and then recording or controlling rather every aspect of what they eat and do. So in the ideal world, in terms of an experiment, you'd put 1,000 people in confinement, and every bit of food they consume, you would provide that food. That's the only way you'd know exactly what they ate and that they were indeed eating that, and that you got them to do exercise or not to do exercise. That would be the only way to robustly know what interventions are making difference to people's health. It's not ethical to do that. We can't do that. Historically, there have been some very interesting cases where that has been done. There's been a couple of prison studies. There was a scandalous, or at the time considered scandalous, study on care homes from a couple of decades ago. There was a study in the Second World War on conscientious objectors. So we've had little glimpses of what happens, but it's just not ethical to do it on the population. So instead, we have to rely on epidemiology. And I want to give you one example of where that can go really quite adrift. This is a headline from 2015. It was in the Daily Mail. It was in lots of papers, but the Daily Mail is the one I remember it from. Bacon gives you cancer. So basically the subheadline was, eating bacon increases your risk of cancer by 20%. Of course, that's another one of those study shows, although it doesn't actually use the two-word phrase study shows. It's one of those, yet again, another study showing something, and I'm sure a month later there was another study showing bacon doesn't give you cancer. But let's take the snapshot of time here with this study. And let me disassemble it, because this is actually quite, the study that's being reported on here is a pivotal study because it is reproduced in lots of places. You'll find this on lots of different websites in various guises. And what's very interesting about this study is the elements of epidemiology, and I can show you what goes wrong with epidemiology in these studies, but also interpretation. So I'm afraid I'm going to go into numbers, but hopefully not very complex numbers. So I'm going to disassemble the data from the study. And essentially what the study did, they sent out those questionnaires. Remember the questionnaire I showed you on the previous slide? What did you eat? What did you eat last week, last month? The results from those questionnaires allowed the people in the study to be divided into those that ate bacon and those that didn't. And if we looked at the outcomes, it was quite a long run study. They took the questionnaires and then observed these people for a good number of years after the study. They looked at the number or the ratio. There weren't 100 people in the study, but there were actually many, many, many hundreds of people in the study. But the ratio was 5 out of every 100 of the non-bacon eaters developed some form of cancer. They were actually looking particularly at colorectal cancer, but the ratio there was 5 in 100. Now, if you look at the headline, eating bacon increases your risk of cancer by 20%. So the box I haven't yet filled, the number of cancer or the number of people in the bacon eating group that develop cancer, you'd expect to be quite a much bigger figure than that 5 out of 100. Well, actually it wasn't. It was 6 out of 100. Now, if we look back at the headline, they missed out one very important word in the headline. To go from 5 in 100 to 6 in 100 is an increase, a relative increase of 20%. 1 in 100, or 1 in 100 is the increase. If 5 is the baseline number of people that get cancer, 1 in that 5 is effectively 20%. So it was a relative increase in your risk of cancer, not an absolute risk, the relative risk. And what matters to you as an individual is your absolute risk of cancer. If you then look at the data within the study, the people who were the bacon eaters smoked more, drank more alcohol, and took less exercise. So here's the big question. If 6 out of 100 rather than 5 out of 100 in that group were getting more cancer, was it because they ate more bacon? Or was it because they smoked more? Was it because they drank more alcohol? Was it because they didn't take exercise? Very likely it's a combination of all of them. And here's a very contentious interpretation of the numbers. Smoking alone increases your cancer, absolutely, not relatively, by at least 8 to 10%. So I would expect the smoking group to have a risk of cancer more like 15 out of 100 or even 20 out of 100 in the long run. Okay, it wasn't a long run study, but certainly a much more increased risk, a much greater risk. So if the risk turned out to be only 6 in 100, did the bacon actually prove to be protective? Was the bacon actually something that stopped cancer being expressed quite so much in that bacon eating group? We'll never know. That's an interpretation. It's a possible hypothesis. But the problem is with epidemiology, you can't disentangle all of that from there. And you'll get an insight into why the headline the way it was when you see who sponsored, not the original study, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but the sponsors of the paper, the scientific paper, that then prompted the headline in the Daily Mail. And the sponsor was Kellogg's. And Kellogg's are people who do not want you eating bacon for breakfast. They want you eating their breakfast cereal. So it's in their interest to generate headlines, eating bacon increases your risk of cancer by 20%. And even better if you can get national newspapers doing it for you. Because then people, when it comes to their supermarket shop and they're pondering what they should buy for breakfast, they're going to steer away from the bacon and more likely steer towards breakfast cereals. So you have to be careful who was paid for a study. The original study was actually paid for by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, I don't know a lot. I've studied a little bit about the Seventh-day Adventist Church because they've got quite a lot to say about our nutritional history, because they, at the end of the 19th century, they were the people who said eating meat causes lustful behavior. And the SDA, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, has a stated ambition to promote their nutritional message to the world. So they are very keen to find evidence against eating meat because they believe eating meat causes lust. And it's interesting that every single study funded by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, every single study that's looked at meat has shown meat is harmful. Well, no branch of science is that reproducible. No branch of science is reproducible. So for every single study to prove that meat is harmful, you begin to think something's a little bit suspect here. So all I'm really saying by all of this is say, just beware. When you get those titles, study shows, there's more beneath the surface. You have to be very careful. Who's paying for it? Who's studying it? What outcome is being looked for? Just be very, very careful. And above all, don't let go of common sense. We've been eating bacon for centuries. Heart disease is a modern condition. And we're actually eating less bacon than we did even 40, 50 years ago. So its contribution to the cardiovascular disease epidemic is questionable, and the cancer disease epidemic equally questionable as well. So just be very careful and do make sure common sense doesn't get thrown out of the window. Now, there are proper studies. Now, epidemiology is one sort of study. What I mean by proper studies is where we're interventional, where you take a large group of people, divide them into two, you don't lock them away. Remember, that was a problem before. But over a long period of time, you instigate behavioral change in one of the groups, not in the other. Follow them over a period of time and see if that's changed the outcomes. And that behavior might be educating them on a certain dietary strategy. Of course, you can't be sure they are following the dietary strategy that you've encouraged them to take, but you take a big enough group in the hope that you do. And there's three very, very big studies. The Women's Health Initiative Dietary Modification Trial of 2006, the Framingham study, which has been ongoing since 1948, and the Predimed study, which is reported on several dates, but one of the most recent reports was in 2018. The Women's Health Initiative study of 2006 looked at nearly 50,000 postmenopausal women, divided them into two groups. One group was given the education, the support to follow a low-fat diet. The other was left to their own devices. And at the end of some people 6 years, some people 8 years, $700 million was spent on this project. That's the scale of this program. At the end of the study, they showed that the low-fat diet certainly gave no benefits to the women, and actually probably on the balance was not as healthful as women who were not told to follow a low-fat diet. Framingham, the same. It's following the inhabitants and the descendants of inhabitants in one town in America. Similar findings, similar study findings. Predimed is actually looking at the benefit of the Mediterranean diet, lots of olives, olive oil, feta cheese, fats and proteins in the diet, and likewise that has shown significant benefits with terms heart disease and cancer outcomes. So there's big interventional studies, as we call them, which are proving maybe the paradigm of low fats, eating high carbs isn't actually necessarily a good thing. We've got some very small scale but very precise interventional studies. The two I mentioned here, both of these are really looking at incidence of type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance in populations, a very small population, but a population that was very, very closely monitored. They weren't put in prison, they weren't restricted, but their dietary intake was very much guided and controlled during these studies, and very measurable biochemical markers were taken before and during after the study. And in both of those studies, type 2 diabetes was reversed, metabolic markers were reversed, and health was improved by adopting diets that took out the vegetable oils, the margarines, the grains and the cereals, and the processed grains and cereals. So they're very recent or relatively recent studies and very important studies. And with regard to the cholesterol myth, a study I absolutely love for its simplicity. In 2009, they looked at nearly 140,000 patients that had been admitted to hospitals in America with cardiovascular outcomes, like heart disease, heart attacks, and that sort of thing. And they measured their cholesterol numbers. And lo and behold, they found that you are more likely to be admitted with a heart attack if your cholesterol numbers are lower than the average in the population. And that was a sample, or recording rather, of 140,000 patients. So there's real studies out there that fit this model. Well, how is it that foods that are supposedly causing cancer, heart disease, obesity, we're eating less of them, but we're more obese and we have more of those conditions? How is it that can be true? Well, these studies are saying, well, actually, probably those foods aren't contributory to those conditions. So let me offer now a little bit of an insight as to, well, how do those foods, so let's pick on what I think are the villain foods. Let's say, well, how is it that they can bring about these conditions? What do we know? So this is the bit which is a little bit techie, I'm going to try and keep it very high level, or as high level as I can, but hopefully it's going to give you a flavor of the mechanism of what's going on underneath. So let me separate the foods out into three categories. We've seen these already, or some of them already. The synthetic fats and oils, so the vegetable oils, the margarines, and as I say, I do mean stuff on a shelf that would be called vegetable oil. I don't mean olive oil, I don't mean coconut oil. And this pure distinction here is an oil that is not naturally occurring in nature. So sunflower seed oil does not occur on its own in nature. You have to chemically extract it, you have to bleach it, you have to stabilize it to give it a shelf life and make it look palatable. That's a synthetic oil. Something in Waitrose even that's called vegetable oil, that would be exactly the same. And margarines, any of the margarines, there's no exclusions there. Even if it's supposedly heart healthy, called Olivio or Botello, or there's all sorts, I don't know what that one's called, there's one a bit like that in its name. I mean, all of the margarines. The other camp here I've got are the carbohydrates. So that is processed, refined, like cornflakes, pasta, and I've got a bit of baking there as well. And the third group is this generic category of processed foods. And it's a sobering statistic that it's estimated that 50% of the diet of a UK adult is made up of highly processed foods. And the processed foods, I won't really necessarily talk about in their own right, but you'll see they fit in with these other two. So the synthetic fats and oils, the reason they're a problem, and it's something I will come back to briefly, is it upsets, it interrupts how your cells communicate with each other. And that's fundamental to how your body operates. The carbohydrates that you eat get converted to sugar in order to be digested, and that it releases something called insulin, which I am going to talk to you about, and that over long-run high exposure, or long-run high exposure to that, begins to cause problems. And the processed foods, well, the big problem with processed foods is they contain both of those things. Because processed foods are, because of the very name, they are produced by companies, those companies want profit, so they'll use cheaper ingredients. And it's far cheaper to use a synthetic oil than it is to use extra virgin olive oil or coconut oil in those foods. And they will tend to go for refined, highly processed carbohydrates to bulk out the food and give it some flavor with the additives. So processed foods probably something I'll drop, but it's because they contain both the synthetic fats and the carbohydrates that is problematical to them. And the carbohydrate group is, although I've just shown in the original pictures the more processed forms of them, there are more everyday forms as fruit juices, root vegetables, fruits, mueslis, bread, all those things. They still fall into the category of carbohydrates. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move on to the next slide. Now, sugar as such is a carbohydrate, and we'll see it's the basic building block, in fact, of all carbohydrates. And in sugar, in three forms in our diet is how people usually recognize sugar: from fruits, from honey, and from everything else. So tate and lard, essentially what I mean by processed granulated sugar. They are our three main sources of sugar. When you eat one of those, or food that contains one of those sugars get absorbed into your blood. They become blood sugar. And here's the first thing of significance. Once it's in your blood, your body has no idea where it came from. It is indistinguishable. So the glucose molecule, that's one of the building blocks of sugar that goes into your blood. If that glucose molecule came from a piece of fruit, from a tablespoon of honey, or a tablespoon of tate and lard, your body would not know the difference. So metabolically, they are the same. There are some ways in which they are slightly different, of course, because the fruit has fiber, the sugar has maybe some antibiotic properties as well, but the actual sugar component, once it's in the blood, it's indistinguishable. Now, your body does not like there being too much sugar in your blood for too long. It's quite harmful. It starts attaching itself to proteins, and when sugar molecules attach to proteins, the proteins can't do their jobs properly. So as soon as you've eaten a meal with sugar in it, your body produces something called insulin, and the little image I've shown you there is a squirrel, because it squirrels away. What insulin does, it squirrels away the excess sugar. So what it does, it acts a positive effect on your blood sugar. It brings down your blood sugar levels. And you can use the technical term here. Insulin upregulates your sugar metabolism. It gets you to start using the blood sugar. It gets you to start using glucose, either to burn it for energy, squirrel it away in your muscles and your liver for short-term stores of energy, or into your fat cells for long-term stores of energy. And because of that last one, because insulin is the hormone that tells you to squirrel away the excess sugar as fat in the cells of your skin, it's the hormone that causes you to be able to pinch more than an inch. And it probably dates me to know that phrase, pinching more than an inch, but it's insulin's a hormone that mediates that response. Now, the other part of the equation, I'm going to call them starches, and they're still carbohydrates. So there's two forms of carbohydrate. There's actually three, but the two I'm mentioning here are sugars and starches. Sugars are your fruit, your honey, and your Tate and Lyle. The starches are essentially longer chains of these basic sugar molecules. So the starch in a potato, the processed flour in pasta, the flour in bread. Even if it's brown bread, there's still starch in there, although they're slightly longer chains of these molecules. When you eat those foods, enzymes, they start in your mouth and it works through the body, breaks those starches down into blood sugar molecule, or into glucose molecules, individual sugar molecules, and they get absorbed into the blood as well. And by the time they're absorbed into the blood, your body still can't distinguish it. So once you've eaten your jacket potato, your bowl of pasta, or your slice of bread, once it's glucose in your blood, your body doesn't know where it came from. It's indistinguishable. So it goes to the same route. It raises your blood sugar level, you produce some insulin. Yes, it squirrels what it can away as short-term reserves and burns what it can, but anything left over, it's going to send to the skin to be stored as fat. And the problem then comes when we start continuously eating those starches and those sugars. We start producing excess quantities of insulin all the time, and what started as pinching more than an inch becomes something rather more substantial than pinching more than an inch. And that's the fundamental mechanism of becoming overweight, and that overweight becoming obese. It's not fat that makes you fat. It's the sugar and starch triggering insulin that makes you fat. It causes adiposity, to give it the correct term. And that adiposity is your body trying to find something to do with that excess sugar. Now, I've added back the synthetic oils and fats, and I've introduced something called insulin resistance. Now, this is really where the science is at the moment. I'm just briefly going to describe it here. And it's this continual bombardment of your body with starch and sugar, triggering the need for insulin. And what happens is the body starts getting deaf to the message of insulin, because there's too much insulin around all the time. Your body starts waning or becomes weary of the message. So it starts not hearing it quite so strongly. But the problem is the body has to hear it, because the insulin is there for a reason. The insulin is there to tuck away your excess sugar. And if it's not tucking away your excess sugar, you've got a problem. It's going to start attaching to your proteins. So the body cleverly starts producing more insulin to get the message across, because the liver, the muscles have started becoming a little deaf to the message. But that then becomes a spiral, because once you start producing a bit more insulin to get the message across, you become a bit more deaf to it, which means you've got to produce a bit more insulin. So we developed this thing called insulin resistance. Your body is not getting the message from insulin. And one of the contributory factors for this are those synthetic oils. Every cell in your body has a membrane around it made of fat. If you eat natural fats, the fats that get incorporated into those membranes are the fats that are almost intended to be there. The synthetic unsaturated fats that are in margarines and vegetable oils, they look and behave in many ways like those natural fats, but once they're incorporated into your cell membrane, they affect the functioning of that cell membrane. And it's the cell membrane that has the ears that listens to the insulin message. And so if you've done things to your cell membrane that means those ears can't listen properly, you've contributed to your insulin resistance. So there's a two-pronged attack. the regular bombardment with sugar and starch, and the introduction of those synthetic oils. And interesting in terms of my journey, for the first part of the dietary journey, understanding all of this, it was all about the starch and sugar. But in the last 8 to 10 months, it's, for me, become increasingly about the synthetic oils and fats as well. It's the perfect storm. And in different individuals, the balance is different. And I might talk about that maybe in the links at the end. But the thing is, once you've got insulin resistance, for various reasons, that then triggers all of these other conditions, or is a predisposition to all of those other conditions. And that is what we collectively call metabolic syndrome: hypertension, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, and cancer. So what we've got here is a group of conditions which are manifestations essentially of the same thing: insulin resistance. For example, too much insulin does two things. It causes, just many things, but two things I'm going to highlight now. It causes blood vessels to vasoconstrict, which means they narrow. And it also causes your kidneys to start pulling pulling sodium from the pre-urine in its route as it's filtered through the kidneys. And if you're producing too much insulin, that narrowing of the blood vessels and that extra sodium in the blood, which is going to ultimately increase blood volume because the body doesn't like too much sodium in the blood, so it's going to put more fluid into the blood. You've got more blood going through smaller channels, you've increased your blood pressure. Insulin, we've said, because it tells the fat cells in the skin to start storing excess sugar as fat, it will cause obesity. Type 2 diabetes is where the insulin resistance has got to the stage where your body just cannot produce enough insulin. Your body is short of insulin, not because it's not producing insulin, that's type 1 diabetes, but type 2 diabetes is you've produced, or you've got so insulin resistant, your body just cannot produce enough insulin. The pancreas has reached its limit, it cannot make any more, and you're not getting the message across. Insulin resistance causes inflammation of the endothelium that lines your artery walls. That is the starting event which leads to cardiovascular disease. So you can see we've got these triggers. Through there being too much insulin in the body, we have got the predisposing environment for these conditions to start. And that is metabolic syndrome. And if you remember from that clip we had from the Mcgovern hearings, when he sort of called in check that scientist who said, well, shouldn't we wait until we've got all the evidence? This is the evidence he didn't have. In 1977, they did not know the role carbohydrate and vegetable oils played in the development of metabolic syndrome. Had he had that knowledge, I'd like to think history was different, but he didn't have that knowledge. And it wasn't at his fingertips. But as the scientist said, we need to know the dietary changes we're going to implement are safe. And that was the thing Mcgovern said, I haven't got time to wait for that. So there's my historical perspective on why we are in the situation we're in. And there's the three-pronged attack. Obviously, the first two, the sugar and the starch, effectively different aspects of the same coin, but there is my view of the mechanism. Let me put all of that into a very specific, I'm just looking to see how we're doing for time. We're doing pretty good for time, actually. I think I might actually be on target to be under time, which is actually unusual for me. I'm going to look at counting carbs. I'm going to give you an example of a daily intake of food that hopefully doesn't sound too unreasonable. The quantity may be a little bit more, but it really amplifies my point. If you're eating starch and sugars, how much of the triggering sugar are you actually eating? Triggering of insulin, how much of that are you actually eating? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a little running total of equivalent of teaspoons of sugar from the foods in a typical day. And I'm going to start the day with breakfast. The breakfast is going to be quite a hearty breakfast. We're going to have a glass of orange juice. That's 5 teaspoons of sugar. We're then, on top of that orange juice, we're going to have 2 slices of toast and marmalade. That's 8 teaspoons of sugar. They're quite big slices of toast and marmalade, but there we go. And the marmalade, of course. And we're going to have a generous helping of muesli, quite a rich muesli. I'll have to say I've been a little bit over-egging my cake, pun intended, that this is actually but a luxury muesli with some milk. That's 14 teaspoons of sugar. So by the time we've had breakfast, that's 27 teaspoons of sugar already. Okay. Mid-morning, we're going to go and have a latte. From the days when we could nip out and go and have a Costa, have a latte. That's 4 teaspoons of sugar from the milk that's frothed up in it. And we'll have a biscuit to go with it. So that's 6, that particular biscuit. It's not to scale with a cup of coffee, but there we go. There's the biscuit that goes with it. For lunch, we're going to have a jacket potato with beans and cheese. That's a staggering one, that one. 18 teaspoons of sugar. Well, it's not in the form of sugar. These are starches primarily. There's quite a lot of sugar in beans, actually, so there is sugar in the beans. But in the potato itself, it's starches, but there is a lot which can be, when it's digested down, becomes effectively sugar. Remember, once it's in your blood, your body doesn't know where it came from. It might as well have been taken lyle. For pudding, we're going to have a low-fat fruit yogurt. That's 8 teaspoons of sugar. Mid-afternoon, we're going to be virtuous. We're going to have an apple. That's 4 teaspoons of sugar. Then for supper, we're going to have spag bowl, lots of pasta, 14 teaspoons of sugar in the starch there, and the tomatoes and the sauce that goes in the spag bowl. Quite a staggering tally of teaspoons of sugar. Strawberries and cream, just 2. The sugars in strawberries are different. They're actually fructose, slightly different sugars, has a different metabolic consequence. So therefore, in terms of our glucose load, the blood glucose, which is the thing I'm measuring, that is less. So the grand total of all that food in one day is 83 teaspoons of sugar. That is half a bag of sugar. Okay, now this is where in a room of people I get the sort of the feedback and the jaw dropping, because that is quite a significant scale of sugar consumption. Now, okay, I've been generous with the food. I don't know how lockdown's going for you, but it's probably very easy to be indulging on that sort of scale without really realizing. But even if it's not quite to that scale, you're getting a measure of the quantity of sugar we're talking about here. Let me contrast that with one of my typical days. Now, those who've seen me on Facebook, there's no ox heart, there's no ox tongue, there's no liver, there's no kidney in this. This is all pretty much more reasonable. Notice I kept one thing. I kept the strawberries and cream, because that's only 2 teaspoons of sugar. I started my day with a spinach salmon omelette, probably a bit of cheese in there as well. A black coffee, chunk of cheese mid-morning to nibble on, another black coffee. A meat soup, quite a rich meat soup, so there's lots of chunky bits of meat and a few little bits of green veg in there. Some pecan nuts to help it down, or as like a dessert at the time. My main meal in the evening is a chicken and broccoli bake with a green salad, a green leaf salad, and my strawberries and cream. Now then, how many spoonfuls of sugar do we think that is? Okay, it doesn't sound, you know it's different, you can see it's different, but you'll get a scale of just how different that is. That is only 7 teaspoons worth of sugar. That's all the sugar and starch boiled down, enzymed down, if you like, that's the word, in your body. That is 35 grams of sugar. And you compare that with, is it going to move on? Yes, it is. With the total we had from the other day's worth of sugar, and that was 415 grams. And the problem is, if you eat more akin to the left-hand one and on a regular basis, that is what then, because of that constant bombardment with sugar, is going to give you the insulin resistance, the insulin response from eating all that sugar, and those concomitant conditions, hypertension, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, and cancer. That is the problem I'm trying to address. It's the hidden insulinemic effect of the food you're eating, the insulin causing effect of the food. So there's my discussion of how bad it is. Let's just look at the oils bit. Here's the label from, because I don't buy bread, I couldn't take a picture. So this might well be an American brand of bread. I don't know for sure. But if you look, you can see it tries to be promising. Look at all these nutrients, vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, all these vitamin Bs. Oh, look at all that. We're getting quite a lot of all of that in our slice of bread. Then you look at your ingredient list. I have a little rule. Try not to eat food that has more than 5 ingredients. I haven't counted those, but that's more than 5 by just simple inspection. And what's interesting on there, we have soybean oil. The soybeans do not naturally produce oil. That is a synthetic oil. That is not good for you. It's only a little bit because it's in that group at which none of the group of that party ingredients list can be more than 2%. It says that, I think it says, or 2% or less of each of the following. So it's in that small category. But of course, that's in every slice of bread that you ate from that loaf. Let's also look at mayonnaise. But this mayonnaise is an interesting mayonnaise. This is deemed as extra virgin olive oil mayonnaise. And indeed, it does have extra virgin olive oil in it. But look at the oil that's more prominent. Oh, it's disappeared. The oil that was more prominent there was the soybean oil. So although there was extra virgin olive oil in that mayonnaise, the bigger ingredient was your unnatural synthetic oil, soybean oil. So you just be very, very careful with foods that you're not controlling what's gone into them. and in particular be aware of the carbs from the food you're eating as well. So that was sort of the point in the original talk, but at this point, and I'll still do it at this point, is I want to bring back those 4 concepts that I introduced at the very beginning. Let's look at fat babies. Now, fat babies are interesting. Humans are the only mammals that give birth to fat babies. And that's quite a significant thing, because there's a cost to the pregnant mother to invest energy resources in making the baby fat. So there's got to be some evolutionary advantage as to why mammals, human mammals rather, have evolved to give birth to fat babies. And we think it's to do with brain size, but it involves insulin resistance. The human brain relative to the size of the human body is the largest ratio of any other mammal. And that's probably contributory to us becoming the apex species on the planet. But there's an issue. If you give birth to a baby with a big brain, that is a risk for both the baby and the mother at the birthing process, because the skull is too big, very big, and that's going to have obviously life-threatening consequences. So the solution seems to be for humans that we actually give birth to babies with brains that are slightly smaller per body size than they will be in the adult human, but also equip the baby with the building materials built in to build the brain rapidly once the baby is born. Well, of course, the building material for brain, your brain is 25% cholesterol. It is mostly fat of any form, and water, of course. So but by giving birth to a fat baby, you've equipped the baby with the fuel tank and the resources to build that brain very quickly. And so in the first 9 to 12 months of birth, the baby's brain grows disproportionately quicker than the rest of the body. So that's the evolutionary advantage of giving birth to a fat baby. Well, how do babies become fat? Well, we now understand that in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, the baby actually switches on insulin resistance. It has that switch in the genes. And remember, one of the consequences of insulin resistance is obesity. So effectively, the baby becomes obese by switching on the insulin resistance gene. That's consequently also why some mothers become gestationally diabetic, because the effect of that switch comes across the placenta and makes the mother diabetic as well. But it does mean in the human genome, we have a propensity to use this insulin resistant switch. It's been a positive thing for us in our evolution of brain size. Now with processed foods and refined carbohydrates, maybe it's turning against us. It's been a survival advantage, but maybe not so now. So that's the theory with regard to fat babies and how that fits in with insulin resistance. Some of the fattest populations in the world are Pacific Islanders. And we've got an insulin resistant theory for this as well. The first settlers to these islands are incredibly remote. So the first settlers to get to those islands would have had to have traversed thousands of miles of ocean. Very primitively, we're talking a long time ago for the first settlement of many of these islands. That would have been a crossing of extreme endurance for any human. So there would have been a selection process in those first potential settlers in those boats trying to get to those islands. There would have been a favouring that those individuals on those boats that had the metabolism that could slow down the metabolism, create and use fat stores, were more likely to survive the journey to get to those islands. So through a process of selection, I won't call it natural selection because obviously it was a human activity that did it, but a process of selection may well have favoured that the genetic composition of those islanders will be favouring insulin resistance because it is a survival advantage in such extreme conditions. And what's very interesting here, but in a very sort of macabre way, is that in COVID-19, one of the correlates is obesity. If you're more obese, you're more likely to have poor COVID-19 outcomes. And it's been raised and discussed quite a bit that seems to differentially select Black and minority ethnicities. Well, of course, there's one very, very shocking part of human history is the slave trade. And a lot of people of Black origin in America and the UK and indeed Western Europe are descendants of those first people that were brought across for the slave trade. A similar gruesome, grim crossing for those first Blacks that were brought across in horrendous conditions in those first boats to the West Indies. A similar selection advantage probably took place. those with the insulin resistance genes, most able to have their fat reserves and mobilize those fat reserves, use and develop those fat reserves, were probably the ones most likely to survive. So in the genetic composition of those original slave people, there would be more incidence of the insulin resistance gene, making them more prone to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and so on. Autumn. Autumn is an interesting one. Prior to anything to do with grains, prior to 10,000 years ago, as a species, humans would probably have only come across significant quantities of sugar in their diet in the autumn, late summer and the autumn, when fruits were on the trees, and for a very narrow period of time, literally probably weeks, depending on where they are. Certainly in where we are in Britain, the fruit season would have been quite short. It would have been the natural berries that we would have access to, no guavas or avocados or anything like that. We would have access to berries in a very short defined season before we became an agricultural species. And it seems very clever that we've associated the time of the year, or that the time of the year we would have had access to sugar is the season that precedes winter. And as a species, we have a survival advantage to be fatter in the winter. So it's a very clever evolutionary adaptation that if we start eating sugar, it triggers insulin, it triggers us for fat storage, if the only time we have access to sugar is those weeks preceding a winter. The more fruit you eat, the more fat you become. You stop eating the fruit when winter arrives because the fruits run out, and then you're better able to survive the winter because you have those fat layers. Of course, you live off them, you use them during the winters. When it comes to the spring, you've lost that fat, and you go through the cycle again the following autumn. The problem is we're forever autumn. We've got fruit and carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, particularly in our diet all the time. So there's an interesting perspective there. And the fourth one in my list, Alzheimer's and dementia. I don't know whether any of you have come across some of the thinking at the moment, but Alzheimer's is now being considered to be type 3 diabetes. And that's a measure of its coincidence with all those other conditions, the hypertension, the type 2 diabetes, the cardiovascular disease, all to do with an impaired glucose and insulin mechanism. And it's interesting that in the brain, impaired glucose and impaired insulin mechanisms affect the ability of the brain to derive energy, but also for the brain to receive the building blocks for maintenance. Basically, they're called ketone bodies. They're fat, forms of fat that the brain uses to repair and develop brain cells. And in a high insulin, high glycemic body environment, you have far fewer ketones. So, as I say, much of the evidence or much of the discussion at the moment is, should Alzheimer's be considered as type 3 diabetes, and with that dementia as a form of Alzheimer's? And it's probably no coincidence that those conditions are significantly more prevalent in a population that's been cutting down on its fat reserves and eating more glucose and carbohydrates for 40 years. It's probably an end result or one of the consequences of that dietary change. So there were the 4 points that would have naturally concluded the talk as I delivered it before, and that is almost spot on, just slightly over the hour. So let me now do the COVID update. Now, the COVID update, you can't have missed the fact that much of the discussion, maybe not as much as there should be, but much of the discussion is correlated with severity of COVID-19 outcome seems to be correlated with obesity, high blood pressure, high blood glucose, many of the things that I listed on that list associated with insulin resistance. And so is there a relevance here that maybe that is an important factor in how we mitigate some of the COVID-19 issue? And I've linked together 3 headlines here. The first one, obesity linked to coronavirus disease. The first slide, the first picture I started with this afternoon, Britain is the fat man of Europe. So is it therefore any surprise that Europe, this was a headline from mid-April, so by then we were suspecting, we now know, but we were suspecting we would have the highest death toll in Europe? Well, actually, in the context of those first two things, maybe it's not surprising. Maybe one is a correlate of the other. And here is the data in a slightly different form. This is looking at data from China. Down the left-hand side, we've got cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory disease, hypertension, and cancer. And the length of the bar, the longer the bar is, it's showing how much more that seems to impact the severity of COVID-19 outcomes. Heart disease, diabetes being the top 2, then respiratory disease, then hypertension not far behind, and not far behind that, cancer. And yet all of those things do have a manifestation in metabolic syndrome and association with insulin resistance. Notice with no and none of those conditions, the risk factor is very much more reduced. Well, how does that work? What do we know about metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance that makes that a likely outcome? It's quite technical. I'm going to give you two examples. Adiposity. Now, having fat cells, having expanded fat cells in your body, triggers something in your body to do with your innate immune system. Those cells, because they have too much fat within them, are partly triggering an immune response. The body almost considers them not to be one of your natural cells because they are overindulged in fat, to give it sort of a more anthropomorphic description. Because those adipose cells, those excessively adipose cells, are triggering an immune response, your immune response becomes slightly dulled, becomes slightly desensitized. And one of the parts of that is something called cell eating. A little visual diagram here. When a viral or a cell that's been attacked by a virus is spotted by the innate immune system, the cells that deliver that part of the immune system undergo something called phagocytosis, where they ingest these cells that have been invaded by the virus because they're recognized as being foreign cells, and basically destroy the cell in this thing called phagocytosis. But if these cell-eating phagocytotic cells are slightly switched off because of the raised response from adipose cells, or potentially raised response from adipose cells, then your immune system is slightly dulled. And the more fat you are, the bigger the consequence of that effect. So because you might be carrying excess weight, there's one very well documented mechanism by which your ability to deal with an invading pathogen might be diminished through that phagocytic process. Another diagram here, rather more complex. It doesn't matter, but the thing that I want you to be aware of are the two ends of that process: a viral infection and what we call a cytokine response. Now, with it, viral infections are quite clever. Many of them are quite clever. What they do is they upregulate your glucose metabolism. That's a phrase I used quite a long time ago in this talk, so I'll come back to that. But what viruses do, they upregulate your glucose metabolism to give your body ready energy. It's almost like the virus knows. If it can upgrade your ability to produce energy, the cells that the virus attacks are much better and much quicker able to produce copies of the original invading virus. And through those various steps there, O-link, beta, N-acetyl glucosamine transferase, and interferon regulatory factor 5, and a process called ubiquitination, we get something called cytokines. Now, cytokines are proteins that send signals to the body to do something, to muster forces to deal with the invasion. They can be inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory. And you may have heard the phrase cytokine storm, which is associated with very severe outcomes of COVID-19. Well, this is where insulin resistance comes in, because if insulin resistance is metabolically occurring in the body that's been invaded by the virus, the hyperglycemia, the high levels of glucose that triggers, will yet further upregulate your glucose metabolism. The virus is already doing it, and then your insulin resistance does it even more, so that rather than just producing cytokines, you become more prone to this thing called the cytokine storm. So the insulin resistance has predisposed overexpression of this immune response pathway, leading to too many cytokines, hence the cytokine storm. Now, here's a clip from this is David Katz. He's quite a prominent researcher and very outspoken in this form of dietary change. And on the 6th of May, I've got no idea when that was because the days are merging into each other. There was a Senate hearing, Senate debate, and he contributed, and I've got a couple of minutes from his contribution from the Senate debate here. And he is talking about COVID-19 outcomes and how if we can mitigate the effects, I can't recall if he uses the word insulin resistance, he may not use the phrase insulin resistance, but if he's saying basically if we can mitigate these effects on our body, we can minimize or certainly reduce the impact of COVID-19 on our
I think we've been relatively, if I may say it, contemptuous of chronic disease simply because it's chronic. The human nervous system is sort of hardwired to perceive threats that come at us fast. The fight or flight response, right? It's something that's coming at you in seconds, minutes, hours, maybe days, activates your adrenal gland, gets your attention. Well, COVID has it. Everybody's fixated on this. But a large segment, I actually shared via the chat function of paper that colleagues and I just pre-published today, looking at the prevalence in the United States of these chronic disease liabilities that increase the acute risk for severe COVID infection. So that's exactly what I'm saying. These things are hyper-endemic. But the good news is Dietary practices can modify immune function, improve immune balance in a matter of hours, significantly in a matter of just days, and profoundly in weeks. Control of type 2 diabetes can be improved significantly with lifestyle intervention over a very short period of time. Blood pressure can be lowered. Inflammatory states can be mitigated. So the very same things we maybe should have been thinking about before to make America healthier now really becomes a matter of acute defense against COVID.
Okay. I cut him short a little bit there, but he got the message across. And the key thing I want from that message was that he gave the timelines, hours, days, and weeks. Because you can affect your levels of glucose and insulin in the body from the point of the next meal you eat, you can start making a change. These things can have quick responses. And just going back to this slide here, this was actually plotting what they call case fatality rates. So how likely is it, if you got the infection, was it going to lead to fatalities? And the longer the bar, the higher the case fatality rate. Well, there's only actually one case fatality rate that matters, and that's yours. That's the key one. And from exactly what David Katz has just said in that piece, and exactly what I've talked about in the body of this talk, and you can do something about that. You can do something to reduce that, and it starts with your next meal. It's as simple as that. Longer term, yes, you have to make more radical changes, and I'm quite happy to stay online afterwards. We'll talk specifically about the changes. But essentially, the spirit of all of this is that you think about those contributors to the metabolic syndrome, the insulin resistance that I talked about. And that was, sorry, I've moved on to a few little points, but let me finish the sentence I was going to say there. You think about those contributors to your diet, the starches and the carbohydrates, the starchy sugars and carbohydrates more generally. Make sure there's no processed food in diet that could be delivering these synthetic oils and margarines, because they're cheap. They will be in your processed food. Eliminate those from your diet, but critically get your insulin and blood glucose levels on more manageable control by starting to restrict your carbohydrate. Look at that day's food we had with the jacket potato and the toast and the orange juice. Nothing on that day's food was exceptional. Maybe slightly the quantity was, but nothing individually was exceptional. And that was a pound of sugar you ate on that day, just through all of those things. And so here's just a few words of wisdom to finish off the slide. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And what I'm saying there is, don't stick to the low-fat, high-carb paradigm. If you've got any of those metabolic markers, you've got concern that you might have those metabolic markers, don't expect the low-fat, high-carb diet to solve that, if that's probably likely to have been the cause. But the critical thing is, if that's the thing you've always been doing and there's been no change, consider doing something else. Don't expect a different outcome by performing the same behavior. Here's an interesting one. And the key thing is, it's from 1882. 1882. Fatty foods are crucial because they increase satiety and decrease fat accumulation. Avoid sugar, sweets and potatoes. Limit bread and vegetables. Meat of every kind may be eaten, and fat meat especially. It was known. And the history of it is fascinating. I'd say if you're really interested, Nina Tateholt's book on the Big Fat Surprise is absolutely fascinating, how we knew that in the 19th century, but we seem to have lost our way in the last century. Don't blame the butter for what the bread did. The butter was fine. Good, healthy, natural fats. It's the refined carbohydrates in the bread that were the problem. Here's the author of that book. I probably don't say her surname properly, but there she is, Nina. Let's call her Nina. When you understand that even healthy whole grains and fruit can spike blood sugars to spike as much as simple sugars, that's the turning point. Because while everyone agrees sugar is bad, what is also bad are those seemingly healthy foods that instantly turn to sugar in your blood. So that was the message there. And this guy, Professor Tim Noakes, he's the head of the organization which I did my nutritional training with. In 1960, 60% of GPs thought smoking was without risk. And indeed, 40% of GPs still smoked. In 2020, we find this shocking. I wonder in 2080 what history will make of GPs in 2020 who still thought a high-carb, low-fat diet to be healthy. So there's your thought provocation from the prof. So there we go. That was my talk, Survival of the Fattest. Let me